Andy.
Hi, Victoria.
Today we are going to be speaking with an old friend of yours, an old medical colleague of yours, and we are going to be speaking about coincidences.
Yes, it's Dr. Bernard Beitman, or Bernie as I know him, a psychiatrist who has really been instrumental in creating this new field of coincidence studies.
And we actually know him from years back because he spoke at our 2010 mental health conference. And at that time, he was speaking about a much broader way of thinking about depression.
Mm-hmm.
So he continues to be at the leading edge.
Great.
Let's welcome him. Dr. Bernard Beitman is the first psychiatrist since Carl Jung to systematize the study of coincidences. A graduate of Yale Medical School, he completed his psychiatry residency at Stanford and then served as the chair of psychiatry at the University of Missouri, Columbia for 17 years. He writes a blog for Psychology Today on coincidence, and his new book, which was published in September, is called Meaningful Coincidences: How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. Welcome, Bernie.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you very much.
I think it would be great to start with some definitions. So tell us, how do you define a coincidence?
A coincidence is the coming together of two apparently independent events in a surprising way that sometimes looks like it has an explanation, but it doesn't. What the fun thing about coincidence is for much of human existence is that we look at coincidences and find underlying causality that help us understand how reality works.
However, I think most people that I know throw coincidences into a mental wastebasket. You'd say that's a coincidence and you dismiss it and don't attach any significance to it.
Well, that's the people you know, Andy.
Well, you're trying to change that.
I am trying to change that, and you're helping me do that. But it's interesting that you say that most people, and I think it's true because I get a lot of emails. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of that because they feel isolated because of what you just described.
Well, I would say in the medical profession, and probably among scientists particularly, there is that tendency to dismiss coincidences as just, something that's funny but has no real significance.
So, Andy, what do you think is the significance of a coincidence?
To me, they're remarkable that, when I look at them carefully and I want to make them happen more frequently. They generally make me feel good or act as kind of signposts. I think that's what Bernie is trying to emphasize.
Yeah, they, as you just said, they help you feel like you're on the right path. You're in some kind of flow. And that's what they do for you and do for a lot of other people.
And are they all meaningful?
No, that's why there's the word coincidence, and then there's meaningful coincidence, and there's just a coincidence. The adjective makes a difference. You have to talk about the anatomy of a meaningful coincidence. For example, statisticians like to say random for all of it. And I say, well, there's mystery involved here too, and in between is your own agency that has something to do with it. Meaningful coincidences, which are simply not just serendipity, synchronicity, it's usually mind and environment, connections between mind and environment.
Let me tell you one, this was a while ago, but I remember waking up one morning in Tucson and the phrase Sinn Féin was in my head. I didn't even know what it meant. And I looked it up, and that was the name of the Irish Republican movement. And about 6 hours later, I was driving in downtown Tucson, and on a wall was written Sinn Féin. Okay, so, and that makes me feel, wow, this is something, the universe telling me that I'm in the flow.
Yeah, a lot of people use it that way. But let's talk about in medicine, because I'd like to be able to encourage your use of synchronicity in your discussions and your teaching of residents in your integrative medicine program, because I think they can play a role in medicine. What do you think?
Can you give an example of that?
The discovery of penicillin is one of the most outstanding serendipities in modern medical pharmacology. A lot of pharmacology has taken place and discovered by accidents, happy accidents.
But that's serendipity. That's not the same as synchronicity
Well,
or coincidence.
if you look at the title of my book, Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen, what I'm trying to do is say both of them are forms of meaningful coincidences, and they have overlap.
Mm-hmm.
So can you define serendipity?
Happy accident is a very simple way of talking about it. A little longer way of saying is looking for something and finding it in a way we're unexpected, which is what Alexander Fleming did. What happened with Alexander Fleming in 1921 is he had a running nose, and a drop from his nose fell on a petri dish with some bacteria on it. And then he saw a halo of inhibition where that drop fell. And that led to the discovery of lysozyme, something that could lyse cell walls. He was very much looking for something to stop the major infections that happened in World War I, because a lot of people died from the infections, not from the actual shells.
So what about the common occurrence, it seems to me, where scientists sometimes across the world from each other are coming up with the same discovery? So you have hundreds of years of effort, nothing, and then suddenly somehow in the same 2-week or 1-month period, 2 different scientists discover the same thing. Is that a synchronicity or a serendipity?
It's whatever you want to call it. It's a coincidence. And what I look at, a meaningful coincidence, and the term simultaneous independent discovery is the term applied to them. And they happen a lot. A 1923 book on the subject had hundreds of them, and they keep happening often, more and more often. There's one about on February 14th, since we just had Valentine's Day, 1876. 2 guys walk into the U.S. Patent Office with the same almost diagram of the telephone.
It also seems to me that one principle is that similar things tend to happen together.
I think you're right.
And it seems to me that the experience of coincidence or synchronicity hints at some underlying structure of the universe.
Yes.
You mentioned that we should watch for this in our medical training, and we've given some examples of how scientific research progresses. But what about in the clinical practice of medicine?
In the clinical practice, sometimes, as I had one example, I was doing a CME thing. I'm a psychiatrist. And for some reason, I looked up a CME thing on sleep apnea. So I did the CME, and the next day a guy walks in with a thick neck and a big belly who is having some depression problems, and he fit the criteria of sleep apnea, which I just read about the day before.
And otherwise, you feel like you might not have recognized that syndrome?
I think I would have had a lot more trouble. It helped. They help. I mean, I had to have some basic idea about it. But there's another version of this that I wonder if happens to you that's a little more subtle than that. There's an experience reported by many people of experiencing the pain or distress of a loved one at a distance. This was the original definition of telepathy, tele, at a distance, pathy, feeling, but then it became more cognitive. So I called it simulpathity, just to have a different name for it. And sometimes physicians, therapists, primary care physicians with close connections with patients can find that they're feeling something or dreaming something about a patient who may be in distress. And what I'm suggesting is that this intuitive capacity that we all have, because the data that I have has shown that this capacity exists in a lot of people, that physicians be encouraged to look at themselves, to know maybe there's something going on with one of their patients that they need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that doctors are discouraged from using intuition. Probably most people are in schools, and we're taught to pay attention to objective data. But my experience is that all great diagnosticians rely on intuition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And how are you doing that in your program, increasing people's confidence and intuition?
You regularly speak of that. I mean, you regularly suggest that our fellows pay attention to their intuition because it is a source of important information. So you counter the predominant message with that message.
Do you give examples?
Yes, I give some case examples from my clinical experience.
The place it shows up most often, I would say for me, is more with loved ones than patients. I'll be thinking about somebody and thinking, oh, I should call them. And the phone rings and it's that person. And I feel like that happens way more than one could say by chance alone.
And there's been some actual research on that done by Rupert Sheldrake, controlled experiments showing that it's not random, that the chance of people getting it right on who's calling is higher than chance.
Go
That
ahead.
seems to point to that relational aspect, that when it's someone who you are particularly close to, so that could be perhaps in a psychotherapeutic relationship, a patient you're feeling especially connected to. It could be a loved one. It could be a friend. That it perhaps happens more frequently.
Victoria, the data show that, just what you're saying.
Yeah.
Bernie, where is the field of coincidence studies, which you've been instrumental in developing?
Well, tomorrow we are launching the Coincidence Project website. And we have something called the Coincidence Cafe, which occurs once a month from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Each third Saturday of the month. And we're getting more and more people coming to that. More and more people seem to be getting into this idea. Maybe it's because I'm in the middle of it, so they contact me, but I'm getting a lot of people very interested and wanting to be able to come together to recognize and utilize meaningful coincidences.
So is there a field now of coincidence studies?
Well, you know about fields.
Yeah.
You have to have it in your own mind first, and of course, it's been in my mind for quite a while. And what we're right now, we have a board. We have a board of 10 good people. We have programs coming up once a month, and we are ready to launch into a larger venue. So what we need is cash to be able to do the research after we get the administrative foundation solidified. And I've got some ideas about future ideas for research in it. And I want to bring more and more people into it, and they're coming.
Can you give us an idea for research?
Yeah. There are hundreds and hundreds of coincidence stories that we've collected, including ones like you with the thought and the sign. What I want to do is have people look at the stories and look for patterns in them, and then have artificial intelligence look through the same stories, which they can do now, to see if they can find patterns that human beings can't find.
Do you think that if you focus on coincidences, you tend to experience them more often?
Yes, sir. Do you have any idea why that happens? What makes you say it because it's
well,
true?
That is my experience, and I think it's that they're probably happening all the time, but if you don't pay attention to them, they go away.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that's the kind of data I want to gather to confirm it. But yes, that when I'm asked, how do you increase coincidences, people want to cultivate them. Just keep paying attention to them and they'll keep happening.
You wrote something in a paper. You said, coincidences are clues to the mysterious hiding in plain sight. It's such a beautiful sentence to consider. What do you think we can learn?
We can learn how reality works, which is what's been going on with coincidences for much of humanity. Two things come together and say, why is that? You know, it's really funny because astronomers look for anomalies.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they study. But here on Earth, you get an anomaly like this stuff and you don't look for it. You don't look into it. And that's what I'm trying to encourage people to do. And what will we discover? Well, I think we live in something called the psychosphere, our mental atmosphere. And this mental atmosphere is partly explanation for that simultaneous independent discovery thing that you mentioned, Victoria. We feed off the same ideas collectively. It's a collective consciousness. It's not just the deep unconscious of Jung. There's a lot of stuff running around in that psychosphere, and that gives me a way of explaining telepathy. Nobody knows how telepathy works, but if you use this idea, Tyler Desjardins had it. A lot of people have used the term psychosphere.
Andy, you have talked about our conception of reality being maybe just one way of seeing the world. And there's a tremendous interest right now in psychedelics and in seeing the world in very different ways. So do psychedelics increase our experience of coincidences or synchronicity or serendipity?
Well, I don't have data for that, but certainly in my experience, they do.
Of course they do. And I interviewed a woman with doing psilocybin, psychologist in London for depression. And I asked the same question Victoria did. And not only the patients after they have psilocybin tell them have a lot of coincidences, but also the therapists who are involved. But you know what happens when I said, well, do you report this? They said, too woo-woo. But yes, Andy and I both know that on Haight Street in the late 60s, there were signs or feel like signs that said synchronicity spoken here.
What happened? We had Carl Jung, who was so intrigued and wrote about this so frequently and in depth, and then a very long period of time until you lifted it up. Is it just too woo-woo, or was there some other reason why the interest has perhaps turned aside?
Too woo-woo. I mean, Jung was afraid to write about it because he was afraid that people would make fun of him, and he only did it toward the end of his life that he published it. And I did it because I had my first coincidence when I was 8 or 9. I was weird enough to pay attention to what I saw rather than believing what people told me, and I just needed to write about them. And I started with doing a little research project to find out a survey that how often do these things happen? And they happen quite often, and they're quite common. And I got the data to be able to show it.
Now, is this your weird coincidence survey?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us what you learned from that survey? Because I know you have had more than 3,000 people contribute.
Yes. I wanted to know the most common ones. Victoria, you picked out the most common. You think of someone and they call you Rupert as shown that that happens. It happens quite regularly. People have that experience. Sometimes another frequent one is being in the right place at the right time. So I've come up with an idea called human GPS or internal GPS, where we can get to where we need to be without knowing how we got there. But this internal guidance system gets us where we need to be. And another one is looking for ideas and then or answers to questions and having them appear on the internet or somebody saying something or in some kind of newspaper that you're looking for it and it shows up in a weird way. Those are
one that I used to have very frequently when I was younger that has just started to reappear is I have a word pop into my head, often a word that I don't know the meaning of. And then within hours, I encounter that word in a book I'm reading or an article that I'm reading. Yes. And now it's reappeared. I began to disappear as I got older, but I love to do acrostic puzzles. And recently, words in the acrostic puzzle, really odd things, same thing, it turns up in something I'm reading, within a very short time.
I think, Dr. Weil, those are hints that for your active mind, you might get curious about.
I am. I love it.
And it's so interesting.
As I said, it hints at some underlying structure of the universe in which what's inside our heads and outside our heads is connected.
And when you say that, that's a fundamental principle. What's inside our heads is connected to what's outside our heads, which makes it obvious, if you pay attention to it, that our minds are part of our environment. They're not just in our own skulls.
So
That's
you both have such a positive stance on this, internal GPS, being in the flow. I mean, there's a lot of positivity. Is it ever a bad thing? Does this ever cause people, I mean, you're a psychiatrist, Bernie, does this ever create difficulty for people?
It does. It does. A researcher, woman in San Francisco, who was studying neuroblastoma. She had been involved with prayer and helping AIDS patients at a distance. And the data were pretty good, enough for NIH or NIMH to give her money to do the same thing with neuroblastoma. So as she got started with it, she came to be diagnosed with a neuroblastoma. That's not a coincidence you want to have happen to yourself.
Yeah.
A longer answer to your question is that when you start examining them, as they do in my book, sometimes the coincidence is great for one person and terrible for another person right at the beginning. Sometimes it's the opposite. Good for one, good for, sometimes it's good just for one person and then bad later, and so one person bad, good later on too. So sometimes you have to pay attention to the time sequences of coincidences.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast for these wonderful ideas about how we might stimulate the thought process of our fellows and students, and for bringing this leading edge to medicine and to society.
Thank you very much.